Good evening, everybody. It's so good to see you here. My name is David Plylar. I'm one of the concert producers at the Library of Congress. And I have a couple of just quick housekeeping items I wanted to bring to your attention. I see that a number of people are seated on the sides and everybody's in an okay spot. But if you want, the very first piece that's on the program is going to have use the space, have spatialized sound as part of the piece. And the best way to experience that is more towards the center. So if you'd like to move towards the center, I would encourage you to do that now. You don't have to, everybody's fine, but I would recommend it. And also a little bit farther back too, so if you'd like to, that's another thing to think about. The other thing is that this is a bit of an unusual format for us today, in that we're going to be featuring a work, first by Roger Reynolds, followed by a discussion with the musicians and the composer who is here. And then we'll have intermission. And then we'll have a piece by Kate Soper, followed by another discussion with the musicians and the composer who is also here. So it's an unusual format for us, but we encourage you to stick around. We'll do the transitions as quickly as we can. And the last thing I wanted to mention while people are still getting situated is that earlier today we had a bird that came into the Coolidge Auditorium. This is the Founders Day, which is the 159th birthday of Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge. I like to think that maybe she gave us the bird, but it's one of those things that's just be aware that there might be something taking flight beyond just the music itself. Today. So don't be alarmed if that happens. All right, and so everybody's already situated, then I will get off the stage and we'll enjoy the concert. Thanks so much for coming. they set up a monitor for me backstage so I could hear it. So I didn't have quite the same experience as everybody out here did, but it's wonderful even coming from just one speaker. So thank you so much for that.
The bird took all the spatialization away.
Nice. Well, I have a lot of questions, this whole folder full, but I think maybe a starting point would be just to talk about a little bit about the, if you wouldn't mind, Roger, speaking a little bit about the SHARESPACE series and the fact that you have made sure to let me know of every time that we speak, I think, about the importance of recognizing computer musicians as chamber musicians in this sort of context. I'm wondering if you could say a bit about that.
Yeah, so when I was much younger, I did a series of pieces called Voice Space, and they were quadraphonic, and they dealt with texts that were spoken in unusual ways. And I was very interested in the idea of exploring how not only sound moved in space, but how words and ideas move in space. So at a much later point, let's say about a decade ago, I started working a lot with collaborations. The great thing about collaboration is, of course, you have to give up something of yourself to get somewhere that you couldn't get by yourself. And you have to deal with people who know things you don't know, and then hopefully you know things they don't know. So there's like a reciprocation, which is very nice. So having had the voice space thing, my wife Karen and I were discussing the idea of the series of pieces that I've been writing. There are, I think, 6 now, and they're for solo instrument, like guitar or contrabass or clarinet or flute or something like that. And then there's a computer musician. And what happens basically is that there's an explorative period. They're intensely collaborative, and this piece, Actions, was very intensely that way. There are sort of seeds that I become aware of as I compose little fragments of music, and in the most generous ways, Eric is willing and able to play fragments that are, let's say, trials, right? And to play them with the kind of intensity that is real performance, so that the music is not only relationships, the music is invested emotional response to gestures, to harmonies, to rhythmic patterns, and so on and so on. Then Jacob and I start working with these small, we call them seeds. And basically, it's a genetic model, right? So if the seed is not really ideal, then the result of the algorithmic transformation of it carries that negative element with it. So we often get into a situation where we have something very nice going, so that the seed is producing interesting results, but there's something not quite right about it, right? So then we have to figure out, is it in the process or is it in the seed? So I take all of this exploration as being like a space of collaborative, exploration. I should have not used that word already. So anyway, we explore together. Jacob and Eric, of course, explore themselves independently. They work with the materials. Eric has played a lot of my music, my piano music, and we became friends decades ago. And Jacob and I have worked for quite a while together now as well. So it is a shared space in many different senses. But the one that you call attention to is really crucial. It often is the case, and the same thing exists in theater music, and theater productions. The actor gets the applause. The lighting designer, the musicians in the pit, you know, the director who manages movement on the stage and so on is really quite incidental, right? Everybody's after the actor, the actress. And in this case, one realizes that if you had heard this identical performance, but Jacob had been down there on the floor looking up and so on, you would not have experienced the music in the same way. Not at all. It's crucial that you understand that there are two minds and aesthetic sensibilities that are feeding back and forth ideas. Long answer.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. I guess Jacob and Eric, it would be good to get a sense of what is that collaboration like in performance? I mean, I know that, of course, there's a lot of prep that goes into the production of such a piece, but this was a very, it was different from the one I heard this afternoon, and it was really interesting to get to hear this multiple times, to be able to see how those different iterations yield something quite different. So maybe you could speak a bit about what is this collaborative process that you have.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I would say that in the act of performance, there are very subtle things that go on that are slightly different each time, and some of the lengths of things, some of the sounds that Jacob is manipulating in real time could go on presumably forever until that next cue. And so there are moments, lots of moments in the piece, kind of scattered throughout the different movements, where there's, I don't know, you probably noticed some eye contact, like you would in any kind of chamber music situation, where you sort of one signals the other. Sometimes it's me, sometimes it's Jacob, and then we move to the next step. So there's that. I think the process itself was also very collaborative, and learning which of the sonic ideas that are in the electronics would be fixed and which would be kind of manipulated in real time was another part, something that we had to kind of discover through working on the piece together with Roger. And so there are elements that are going to be basically the same, and then there are these elements which are very free and can be lengthened or shortened, or the sounds can change dramatically from performance to performance.
Yeah, I would say that's correct, or at least it's my experience too. Not that it's correct or not correct. Yeah, there's like a timing is obviously like a really important thing in the sort of in this space where we're making sure that we're at the same pace. Sometimes the computer cues have like fixed time, sometimes they have like endless time, and so knowing that certain things are going to occur at certain places, and other times, when, you heard some of those bits where it's back and forth, it's like, big sound from the computer, big sound from the piano, those are not necessarily fixed in time. Eric doesn't know when things are going to occur. I don't even always know when things are going to occur because of the randomness that we set in the computer. And so that collaboration is like not just, temporal, it's also like musical in that way too, right?
One of the things that I notice when I'm listening to it, and part of this is that genetic trait that, Roger, that you were kind of mentioning with the use of these seeds that are themselves coming from the piano. There's an element of orchestration that comes into play between the two, both at that you can really see clearly at the seams, like when you'll have a same dyad or something like that gets played back to back, or also in those really kind of more percussive sections where the back and forth is really perceptible. And so does it ever how much this is kind of a silly question as I was about to say it, but I'll say it anyway. To what degree does the element of trying to match sonority or is that at the top of your thought process as you're playing, or are you consistently surprised by what's coming, or are you able to take advantage of that surprise to have a better, more interesting musical result, or how do those types of considerations come into play, like orchestration and those types of things?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I was saying to Roger and Jacob before the performance that every place where we've worked on the piece or run through the piece, there is a different experience because of how I hear the electronics out in the space from my position on stage, and then how I choose to fit my part in with the electronics, either in opposition or in a supporting role, or kind of operating together. I mean, there are lots of different ways in which the piano part kind of interacts with the electronic sound. But I have a lot of flexibility in the score to kind of pick different fragments, repeat different things at different times. And so it's very much a kind of real-time, what would work in this moment? Or I need to sustain something on the piano that's going to work with this sound for the next 20, 30, 40 seconds. How am I going to play that so that fusion actually operates and works, is successful acoustically and musically?
Yeah, I think as far as the computer goes, I have a much more limited palette than say if I were playing a traditional instrument. As Roger was saying, we have seeds that sort of go into these algorithms. They do go into these algorithms. And those are predetermined. It's not like a live feed from the piano. So I know sort of in general, the sort of harmony space, the sort of rhythmic space, but the sort of overall shape of the sound is really up to me a lot of the times in the middle of the performance, and especially the spatialization. And so, it's mostly just trying to ensure that in terms of sonorities, say, in orchestration, it's important for me to make sure that I am in the right place in this particular seed when Eric is going to be there. So I have a part that I'm reading through, and I see where things are aligned, and I'm trying to make sure that I'm aligning with him and that he can hear me and these sort of things.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Roger, I'm wondering if maybe you could say a bit more about your use of, without maybe getting super technical, about the use of algorithms, because you use a number of them that you've developed for many different pieces. And this one you use 3 in particular. Maybe you could just say a little bit about how those algorithms impact those use of the seeds and things like that.
Yeah, well, algorithm, in my interpretation of it, means that one is able to do rather complex things in quite straightforward ways. So, for example, as far as I'm aware, the only algorithmic process that exists in music of any culture and any time is the canon. And the canon has a subject. The subject is repeated. The subject is repeated elongated, perhaps shortened, raised or lowered in terms of pitch orientation and so on. But the important thing, at least as Bach used in the musical offering and things of that sort, the important thing is that when the subject is combined with itself, it has to obey new rules. It has to still be harmonically convincing and so on within the tradition that exists at that time. So I was fascinated with the idea of algorithms from the time I was actually trained as an engineer before becoming an enlightened musician. In any case, I was at the French government's facility, IRCAM in Paris, and for 3 large-scale projects. And a co-worker there was working on Louis Armstrong's recordings from the 30s. And what he was trying to find was what strategies did Louis Armstrong use to improvise on a theme? And so he found certain things that Armstrong did repeatedly. And I got interested in that, and I tried to create an algorithmic, let's say, imitation or response to what Armstrong had done in his jazz work. Later in San Diego, working with various collaborators such as Jacob, I developed other algorithms. And the basic idea is that you have categories of sound behavior. And if you see in your programs, David asked me to put something that suggested one of the algorithms. And one of the algorithms that creates the sort of orchestral, long, extended sounds that swell and move and so on. That's called smears. And if you see in your program when you get home and you have better lighting, you can see that I just wrote the word is with chalk, and then I ran my finger across it. So then the elements in the shape of that word trail out over the page. In the musical version, they also precede the element. So if I did this properly, there would be trails coming into the word is, and then there would be other trails coming out. Without getting into details, the others do sort of categorical things. For example, those loud chords that you heard from both Eric and Jacob, those are generated by an algorithm called matrix. And basically what it does is take a single sound and repeat it 6 times, each coming from one of the 6 speakers. And then it gradually misaligns these. So instead of happening all together, the same sound happens, maybe for a while it's going cha, 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 and then it goes cha, 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 cha. So it can get more and more distant from regular simultaneity. So this is the kind of thing. I'm looking for ways that do not create material and they do not create form. They're sort of in the middle. It's like maybe paragraphs and things, if you think of a literary content. It's not a whole novel and it's not a piquant phrase. It's like a middle range organizational thing. And it's one of the ways that I've found to make small things larger and longer, to take moments and cause them to be hopefully more meaningful.
Another aspect of this music that I think Roger mentions in his program note, but if you come to know Eric's recording of the etudes, of Roger's etudes, piano etudes, there's an element here that is also at play that I think is extremely interesting, and this is the role of memory, both in terms of referencing one's own works. It's self-referential because Roger draws from some material from his etudes, and then those etudes themselves were referencing some other works. So there's this sort of distillation over generations of compositional thought that leads to this. One good example would be at the final movement, being a kind of a reinvention of some elements from that C-sharp minor prelude of Chopin, Opus 25, number 7, where there's little hints of it now. But it's not something that you would necessarily expect somebody to pick up on. But yeah, I mean, maybe we can speak about that a bit.
Did you ever think of Chopin at the end?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's this beautiful, poignant music that kind of filters through in the end that you get very clearly, I think, in the last line especially. And the etudes that we're talking about are large sets of pieces that do draw on kind of the repertoire for the piano, which is so extensive and so wide-ranging. And what's been very interesting about this piece is that our work on this was kind of at the same time as we were working through the second book of the etudes. And we were taking elements actually from that second book of the etudes and recording them and using them as seeds in this piece. So these things are all sort of, in a way, related to one another. But the experience of playing this is so extremely different. I mean, it couldn't be more different. It's so spatial and in a sense relaxed and kind of contemplative, whereas the etudes are, kind of an earful at all times. So very different experiences, but it's been fascinating working with some of the same material and in these very different contexts.
there have been occasions previously when Eric has done a recital in which he played not only the, let's say, the first book of etudes, but he would also play the etudes that were quoted in my etudes. So basically it's Chopin and Debussy and occasionally Mendelssohn from the Serious Variations. And also, of course, it has to include Ligeti, whose whose contemporary etudes are certainly a monument to the piano, and also, of course, Liszt. So these things happen, and the idea of seed exists in the pieces in a slightly different way. So I choose a segment from, let's say, one of Chopin's etudes, and I like that little fragment. It may be a bar and a half long, maybe shorter than that. And then using my harmonic ideas, my rhythmic materials and so on, I compose into that literal quote and then compose back out of it. So the music flows without stopping through Chopin or through Debussy or through Liszt or something. And the thing which to me is quite amazing is that even very sophisticated listeners, pianists, hear the etudes and they don't notice the quotes. And what I think that means is that we're so indebted to our sense of continuity, of context. Context often overwhelms detail.
Well, I mean, it's actually an interesting question. I was thinking about, you're asking about memory and how does that relate to sort of what I'm doing. And what's interesting about like the way that Roger works with these like seeds, so it's not real time. A lot of times you'll see electroacoustic music and there's a microphone on the piano that goes into the computer and the computer does sort of stuff. And I talk about it as like sort of a glorified reverb or a glorified delay. It's sort of just like the computer is enslaved by the instrument. Whereas when we use the seeds, we can pull on things that aren't even in the piece or that happened way before or that are precursing what will happen. So it's like the computer providing the memory for eventually the piano coming in and doing the remembering. So
it anticipates as well as remembers.
Correct.
And, one I think turn of phrase that I think you used maybe in these notes or somewhere else was that it's not so much that these are derivations, but they're provocations for like a new sort of usage of them. I thought that was a good. Well, we're just about out of time, and so I just wanted to ask if there's anything else you'd like to say about the experience of making this piece and performing it. Anything you'd like to say?
Well, just to highlight, I think, what an unusual and kind of interesting and sort of eye-opening experience this has been, because I feel like it's more and more common today to talk about how important the act of collaboration is, and we're so aware of the need to kind of reach beyond our own small world of expertise and kind of to connect with individuals, sometimes in fields maybe traditionally unrelated to our own. But this has been great because it's a very satisfying kind of collaboration, and we really did kind of derive this piece together, which is, I think, is a very unusual way of working that you don't find certainly in the music that we mostly are dealing with. So that that has been really a terrific experience.
Yeah, one of the things that one regrets very much after or during or before having the experience that I've had with these two wonderful collaborators is that usually what a composer does is sit in her studio or whatever and write down music, try it out maybe on a keyboard, listen to synthesis of it and so on. But you don't actually hear the performative version, right? And it's one thing to have relationships on a page, and incidentally, everything except the details of the computer cadenzas is specifically written out. So it's not, it's selected in the moment and combined in the moment, but it isn't created in the moment. So I lost my place.
Composers sitting in rooms.
Oh, yeah.
Dictating.
Yeah, so the thing that happens is you think, gee, I wonder how that will work. And one of the first questions that one is frequently asked in interviews is, how do you know what this is going to sound like? You know, you write these huge orchestra scores and things, especially when you add strange instruments and electronics and so on. And I say, I always know exactly what it's going to sound like. What I do not know is what it will feel like. Because the relationships are just the beginning. And the way the relationships are managed by performers is what makes the real reward of musical experience for me.
Well, please join me in thanking everybody here for we really appreciate having you and hearing this performance. This is the world premiere of this version of the piece, so we're extremely proud to have had that. And thank you for the talk as well. And we're going to take a 15-minute intermission, and then we'll have our next piece. Thanks so much.